Welcome to the American Reformer Podcast, hosted by Josh Abbotoy and Timon, Cline. Our mission is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to the American Reformer Podcast. Usual host here, Timon Cline, editor-in-chief. And as is usually the case, I'm joined by a guest in the studio. And today it is Jake Dell. And some of you may be aware of him online. He's written for American Reformer before. You should go check out his articles. We'll drop those in the show notes. But Jake, for people who don't know you, introduce yourself. And then we'll get into explaining yourself and explaining what you're doing.
In apologia, as it were, right?
About. That's right. That's right.
Yes, I'm Pastor Jake Dell. I'm the pastor of First Congregational Church in Woodbury, Connecticut, one of Connecticut's ancient churches. Goes back to the ecclesiastical society that was established in 1659, and then the church itself was organized in 1670. I was ordained in the Episcopal Church, which I served in for about 15 years, and prior to that, several iterations in various careers, marketing, IT, and was a graduate of a certain college in New Haven, Connecticut prior to that.
Yes, that will remain nameless, the fallen college in New Haven. Yes, very, very good. And I think, what we want to talk mostly about today is probably a lot of what you're known for. I mean, others of your public commentary on various issues and some of the stuff we've published is also always worth talking about. But today, I think that, a lot of what you're known for, at least in certain circles, is this Reconquista movement in the mainline, or focusing on the mainline. And as your bio should be signaling to people, you're in the thick of it in a certain way. We can talk about, you can tell us about your congregation particularly, but this is something of a success story in a way. So I think first, though, for people that don't know, we've had some articles on this, we've had some podcasts on this, but just inform people about the Reconquista movement briefly on its genesis and what it's motivated to do.
Sure. Well, my take on the Reconquista movement is that it's a generational answer to a question that's been asked for a long time now. When I was young, when I was the age of these Reconquistadors now, which is to say, somewhere between my age 17 and early 20s, I was part of these institutions. A prep school I went to was owned by the Presbyterian Church, but you wouldn't have known that to save your life. The college I went to was founded by Puritans and Congregationalists. And other than a few, a chapel that you might have seen if you happened to go looking for it, you wouldn't have known that it was an ostensibly Christian institution. So 35 years ago, I was asking the question, how did these institutions get so far off track? And of course, scholars at the time, like George Marsden, answered that in an academic way. But, other than it being a niche academic interest, nobody seemed to care. Nobody really seemed to care, for instance, why Yale College no longer required compulsory chapel anymore for its students. And, I was with the oddball who sort of said, well, maybe we should have compulsory chapel, and then even like at my prep school where there was still compulsory chapel, I was saying, well, shouldn't we put the cross out? Why do you have a bowl of fruit up on the table? So there was this this creeping, whether you want to call it paganism or pantheism or just indifference to the actual doctrines that these institutions stood for, that frustrated me to no end. And of course, at that time, the mainline churches, and we're talking Presbyterian, Congregationalist, Methodist, Episcopal, all of those were dabbling in things like, how far should we take this recognition of same-sex, couples? Should we bless, is it okay to ordain a man or who is a homosexual but is celibate? So they were, the nose of the camel was starting to get under the tent in the Christian mainline Christian churches as well. So fast forward 30 years, my generation, Generation X, has had almost no success in trying to reverse these trends. I would say we've had absolutely no success. They look at the latest Archbishop of Canterbury that was just announced today. I mean, it's been 31 years since the Church of England started ordaining women, and it's taken barely a generation for a woman to now head the institution that's, first one in 1500 years, right? So there's been an aggressive agenda pushed by one side, and the other side, the conservative side, has done almost nothing. So fast forward to 2023 or so, a person named Redeemed Zoomer, an online personality with a large YouTube following. When I first discovered him, he was closing in on 100,000. By now, I think he's got over 500,000, was asking the same questions that I had been asking 35 years ago. And my first response was, this kid just doesn't know what he's signing up for. And I actually sat down to write kind of an open letter to him about why what he was trying to do wouldn't work. And I ended up writing a letter, an article, called Is Reconquista a Good Strategy for the Mainline Churches, that was published over at TruthScript, basically saying, well, you know what? This is actually what I've been trying to do for my entire career. It took a lot for me just to get ordained in one of these churches. I had to go along to get along in many cases. And I think, committed genuinely to a big tent idea. And if there was room for the liberal and the progressive, then there should be room for the conservative. And looking back on that, we can talk about this, but looking back on that, I'm not sure that was quite the right decision, or perhaps that was naive on my part. But what I found eventually is that the big tent wasn't what it was chalked up to be. It kind of collapsed in on itself, and there wasn't much room for genuine conservatives left in these mainline institutions. And it was with that in mind, to kind of warn Redeemed Zoomer that this isn't going to work, that I sat down to write. And I ended up writing a blueprint for how to make it work. And I've tried to implement that since that time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you converted yourself in the process of trying to disprove, many such cases. But let's talk about you. You sort of alluded to that maybe your own approach to staying in the main line initially in the Episcopal Church was maybe not the right decision at the time. I don't know if most people have a good understanding of what the main line is like at this point. They may have a vague idea, but I don't know if they have. Most evangelicals have never had any experience in a mainline church. They've been raised in their own. Maybe there's some parallels they can see in their denominations to what you're describing was happening 30 years ago, and now they're having some of the same battles. It might be helpful to describe a bit about your experience of even getting in and staying in this long mainline denominations as we continue to hit the table here.
I want to be clear. I don't think it was the wrong decision. I was steering by the light that I had at the time, and the institution has changed. I think maybe what I want to emphasize is that I was naive to think that it wasn't heading in one direction, and that, language like dialogue and, it has an agenda to it that tilts left, and it always tilts left. Right. And I think I mistakenly thought, they were operating in good faith. They really wanted conservatives at the table and valued us. And I think that proved to be otherwise. So that's what I want to clarify. As to what the state of the mainline church is, well, you have to understand, that these are our America's historic churches. These are the foundation, the taproot of our original settlement, whether you're Puritan settlements in Massachusetts and New England, Connecticut, like the church that I pastor now. This is the taproot of our American experiment. This is the taproot of American democracy. The town meeting, the democratic process comes from the church meeting that was organized in towns like Woodbury, Connecticut, which was one and the same. The ecclesiastical society was the town, and the town was the ecclesiastical society. So there was no, I don't want to call that church and state, because a town politically isn't enough to be a state. It's an imperfect entity. But there was a fundamental unity of the Christian Christian ecclesia, the church, and the civil order that grew into what we know today. And to minimize the importance of the mainline denominations, all of which have similar stories in the 13 colonies, is to basically ignore the role of Christianity in the American experience. As for what's happening with them today, is that I think subverted is not too strong of a word. If you go back and you read someone like Machen's book, Christianity and Liberalism, he describes perfectly what was happening 100 years ago. And it reads as fresh as as it could be today, as if he written it yesterday. So what happens is you had kind of first a Unitarian spirit slip in, the denial of the Trinitarian nature of our faith, which basically reduces Jesus to a mere man, maybe a great man or a moral teacher, which then allows you to put him on par with the other great moral, quote unquote, great moral teachers, the Buddha, or even a man like Gandhi, who would have been alive in many people's lifetimes. And so you've naturalized Christianity at that point. You've removed the supernatural. You deny the miracles. And then, within a generation or two, they started even to deny the basic morality of Christianity. They marched lockstep with the sexual revolution, which began in the early 1960s with sort of free love and advanced all the way to where we are now with the legalization of same-sex, marriage and now transgenderism. There's no daylight really between the progressive cultural agenda and your typical mainline pulpit at this point. So that's the situation. And for institutions that are, as I said, remarkably conservative, remarkably durable in their genesis and in their DNA, when we gather every Sunday here, I give thanks for 355 years of God's faithfulness, that He has faithfully called this church on this spot for 355 years. So there's a durability and an inherent conservatism to these institutions, but their politics have gone, off the rails.
One thing that I think is always usually asked, let's say by a faithful sort of evangelical who is orthodox in their doctrine, is when they look at a lot of these churches and they see something like the videos, at Union, where you had like the tree costumes marching through, chapel and these sorts of things, is like, why do they keep going at all? Why do these people even show? You've mentioned like the inherently conservative nature of these institutions, but the people inhabiting them are not, obviously. And it's like, why do they continue to exist? Why? Maybe they are dying, maybe they're aging out, but why have they carried on? Like, what place do these institutions still hold in the communities that they're in?
Well, particularly along the East Coast and in the the South, you had a lot of cachet, social cachet. So these churches were often the entree to other social privileges, the right clubs and that sort of thing. They were also extensions, I think, of if you made it to the top of a white shoe law firm in New York City, you were expected to also be on the vestry of a church or on the the board or the session of a such and such a church, and helping to preserve its historical preservation value, or the choir, or the Tiffany windows. So I think the conservation movement, the social move, the prestige that would go with, say, a Metropolitan Museum of Art also attached itself to a lot of these congregations and a lot of these churches, and and they are beautiful and they occupy prime real estate. And so to the extent that there were old families, old money interest, and people who wanted to, and I think this is an important point to underscore, even if they weren't part of those old families, if they aspired to look like them, if they aspired to affect that demeanor, then these churches were a way to achieve that. And so I think that, as the taste of the upper class, as the taste of our elites changed, the main lines moved along with that. It's a kind of a tail wagging the dog effect. So why do people still go? The number of people still going is fairly small. It's important to recognize that even in its heyday, a church like the Episcopal Church had at most maybe 3 or 4 million members. That was at its heyday, its high watermark. Compare that to Methodism, which was always much more populist. It had its elite elements, but it was far more of a popular religion, or Southern Baptists or Baptists in general, or sort of the independents far outnumber any mainline body at any point. So, in the aggregate, but same with the Presbyterians or whatever. So all of the major Ivy League institutions were started by mainline denominations. So the prestige value, I think, can't be underestimated. I think that has waned, though. I think, Gen X is probably the last generation where you're still going to see people of a certain social standing feel like they even want to participate in the church, these churches as a means of expressing their philanthropic aspirations. There's so many other ways to do that now, other than the church.
Yeah. I did, kind of looking through the, you can look through the record of like presidential affiliation. I think Episcopalians are still winning with 9,
right,
and Presbyterians are a few behind.
Well, I think it has to do with the synonymous, the nature of the presidents in Virginia for a long time, and they would have been Church of England. Yeah,
exactly. And then insofar as in the 19th and early 20th century, it was still the Republican Party of prayer. You were just an Episcopalian as you moved up the social ladder.
That's right.
And you can look at the same thing. It does what you saying, Gen X may be the last one where it holds a residual effect like this. Looking at the Republicans in Congress over time, you can see that movement as younger people are coming in. There's less PCUSA. There's less Episcopalians, so on and so forth. And if they're Christians, it's something more non-denominational populist, as you're pointing out.
Well, I mean, look at the Charlie Kirk Memorial, which was done, there would have been a time, I think, when that would have been done at the National Cathedral and would have had, the surplus boy choir singing to the strains of a wonderful pipe organ. And it really, I think, when I saw the Charlie Kirk Memorial, I thought the baton has been passed. I mean, it's, the National Cathedral did enough to disgrace itself during the Trump inauguration that I'm not surprised, but the baton has really been passed.
Yeah. Which leads to the question of, why, what's the impetus for Reconquista? If it's not, is it just buildings? Is it just nostalgia? And then what can really be accomplished by it beyond just getting, the buildings back? Like what is, I hear that a lot as the critique is like, well, everyone likes beautiful buildings, but at what cost? And what's the real cash out for, pursuing this? Because, it requires at least some level of sacrifice and intentionality by people to pursue this. What is motivating Gen Z? If Gen X is the last one to really experience the effect of the mainline, what's motivating Gen Z and others going along with them to even do this?
Well, I can't speak as a member of Gen Z. I imagine some of it might be a certain nostalgia for something they never experienced, which I can certainly relate to as an Xer. I remember I was looking at pictures of my grandparents' greatest generation, thinking, what had happened to us, right? And how did we fall so far? And that fall has only continued to happen. So I think if they're experiencing it from a point of view of a kind of nostalgia for something they never experienced, that makes emotional sense to me. But practically speaking, I think symbols matter, and we're talking about allowing the other side to control a set of symbols for their own agenda that are contrary to what they stand for and what they mean. And so there's two reasons to care about them. The first is a spiritual reason, that these are churches whose lampstand has been removed, but they remain churches and they remain under judgment. And so we should care about them. We can't simply write them off. And secondly, on a practical level, if you're going to be ruled by these people, and the progressives do mean to rule us, then you have to deprive them of the mechanisms and the symbols that they can use to manipulate us. And when they slap a rainbow flag on a historic church in the middle of your town, even if it's an old town in Connecticut that's seen better days, they are making a claim. They care enough about the territory. They care enough about the land. They care enough about the symbols to occupy them. And that ought to tell you something, because that's what you can see is only the tip of what's really going on, I suspect, on a spiritual level.
Yeah, I think so. That I think is the absolute best answer for caring about it. There's another answer that's been given. I don't remember if it was Redeem Zoom or someone else. That's like, this is how, in part, you get the culture back because of the status that these churches have. And the answer I had to that was like, well, they've been sort of cut out of the apparatus of status and influence that they used to be included in. So it used to be, the churches and the boarding schools and the colleges and then the clubs, right? And they all kind of go together, and you have to have membership in each one, by the time you've come of age to have a career in order to have that career.
Right.
And they've been in some ways cut out, as you said. There's substitutes now for younger generations to gain the status the churches gave them. So the question being like, well, if they're cut out, will that really have this effect? But I think the answer you gave, being that the left clearly still cares about them. So they're doing something. They wield some kind of at least symbolic power. And one of the things it does is complete demoralization. I mean, last time I was in Annapolis, Maryland, which has many historic, beautiful mainline churches, all of them have and it's next to a service academy, and then St. John's. It's like the rainbow flags, which were massive, is very demoralizing, and it's making a point. So even if you just owned the real estate to do that, it's like they could have bought a billboard. But they don't do that. Maybe they do that too, but they don't do that there in a town like Annapolis and other East Coast towns. They choose the churches as their billboard. So at least depriving them of this. And then they choose the churches. AOC was giving a speech in a very, very clearly historic church not long ago, after Charlie Kirk was killed. And it's like, there's a point there. They're doing this on purpose. They're in your kind of territory. It's to demoralize you. It's to, sort of smack you in the face with it as they do it. They could have chosen other venues, but they don't. So I think that's the best answer, is to say these still have some kind of symbolic power, to be sure, that we should concern ourselves with. And haven't, for a long time.
I mean, I think where that is very clear is as you say, I mean, I was visiting Annapolis about 6 or 7 years ago as well. And, the chapel there is magnificent, and it's in the heart of the campus, and it's a Christian chapel. You can't say what you will about the First Amendment or separation of church and state. There is a Christian chapel at the heart of the Naval Academy. And the sign, at least it did 6 or 7 years ago, says Protestant worship at the very top. And then below that, Catholic. And, so there's a Protestant chapel, in the heart of the world, one of the world's, I don't know where we rank now, but certainly one of the largest navies in the world, right? I mean, and you think about, okay, I'm okay being ruled by Protestant Christians. I don't want to be ruled by whatever the rainbow flag is. And they will certainly plant it there when and if they can.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And they, it's certainly institutions it's embedded in that are basically, we should call them mainline institutions, as you said, just like with the Ivy Leagues, because of when they were founded and the symbols that were included in it. So those are captured through policies and symbols as well. But then it's just, there's something even more demoralizing about the ordinary, historic churches that may not be connected to other institutions around towns, up and down the East Coast, that are just all enveloped by this, So it's one thing if it's like, well, this is a government institution. It makes sense that they were able to do this kind of quickly and authoritatively, but to take all the, sort of all the real estate and to just do the, paint it over. And again, they're spending, significant money and time to do this, even if we can sort of laugh at some of the practices and question the sincerity of the people still attending them. There is something going on. And I think you're totally right to point conservatives to caring about these dynamics of culture shaping. And even spiritual formation in a way, and historical, capture, that this is how it's done. It's not just the 1619 Project in print. Right. It's these things in your face, because not everyone even reads the New York Times. It's got to be something more visible. Exactly.
And I think you're very right. The word you're using, demoralization, is absolutely 100% exactly right. That's exactly what it is. It's demoralization. But there's a passive element to everything we've been talking about so far. Because you as you're going to work in the morning and you drive by that church with the rainbow flag, that's not what you're caring about as you're listening to, news talk, whatever, and getting the traffic report. But what you should care about is that in many cases, these mainline churches are not just, passive symbols of who actually rules you. they are actively trying to subvert you and destroy things that you care about. They are the moral equivalent of open sewers is not too strong of a word. And so when, if the sewer line breaks in your town, everything stops and you clean it up because it's a public health hazard. Well, if your local mainline church is promoting gender dysphoria and social contagion and other licentious doctrines like two men can marry each other, they are ruining the morals of your town and of your state as well. And in a state like Connecticut, believe it or not, that is unconstitutional. There is a provision in the state constitution that prohibits churches from promoting licentious behavior and harming the public good, right? And so, they are acting outside of the law when they do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. And what's, as the strange sort of legal world we live in is where, basically is a one-way ratchet to make sure you can break the law in that way, right? So as to prevent any kind of oversight and prevent any moral standards being exacted on these types of people. It only goes one way. It's been to de-Christianize and secularize America since the 50s, and these as you're pointing out, these institutions have aided and abetted that. And you could say, on the one hand, well, that will bring God's judgment on them and eventually they'll die out. But, when, how long is that going to take? So I think it's totally right to have concern for this and to wake people up to it. And, there is something, again, with the demoralization theme, the church I attended in Philadelphia, an Orthodox Presbyterian church, which had a nice building, has been around since the 20s. But to get there, you would pass, the mainline PCUSA church, which was more grand and kind of up on the hill, prime real estate and not as well attended probably. But it does make you sort of subconsciously think every Sunday, like, well, we've lost, we had to start our own sort of marginal thing. We've lost the country, we've lost this community, so on and so forth. And I think that's intentional. It's to tell you that you've lost the whole time. It's sort of like putting, the heads of your enemies on stakes outside the city. It's to remind you this is over for you. And that even as someone who's like passionate about renewing our nation and taking it back, that message gets through all the time of like, well, we're not going to be able to get those things back, or how long will it take, or at what cost, sort of thing. So I think that's totally right to understand these modes of communication as being important, which, I don't know why it is. Maybe you have a theory of why conservatives are counterintuitively, we should think based on principles, are not interested in these things or don't pay attention to them.
Well, there's two competing American zeitgeists or experiences, right? One is the idea of everything we've been talking about, which is we're going to establish a city on the hill. We're going to, our mission to the wilderness is the mandate that, churches like mine were set up to fulfill. But very quickly, the successive generations wanted to migrate and do their own thing. And so I think that migratory spirit, the frontier spirit, is equally American, and I think it goes a long way to explaining why it's easy to not care and just do your own thing. It's a huge country, right? So if your grandparents' generation had it good coming over on the boats and settling in Connecticut, well, you can have it better opening up the Tennessee Valley, right? And then you can have it even better going into Texas and to the Pacific Northwest. So I think both spirits are both experiences are legitimately American. Now, the thing is as settlers moved west, they if you look at a map, you'll see the spread of the Congregational churches across this country mirrors the migratory patterns of people from New England, right? So there's a reason why towns in Ohio look like towns in Connecticut. So there was this sense that even though they were doing something new, they were still bringing with them and replicating something that had gone before them. And to explain the rupture as to why we seem less interested in that in the last generation, I think, is to try to, understand the youth culture of the 1960s and what was going on there. And, that may be beyond the scope of our discussion here, but I think that is a foreign, that you look to that time, that post-war generation, and there really is something new going on there, an influence that I think ultimately is un-American.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the sort of impulses you described are right, and but as our friend William Wolf pointed out recently in a talk, I think quite rightly, and of course he's a Southern Baptist, and that's his focus. But generally speaking, was that when this is the same story, when institutions failed or they fractured, there was always more space, always westward to go, and like we reached the coast a long time ago. At some point, there's nowhere else to go. You're going to have to work with what you've got and save what you've got.
Right.
Unless we want the first Congregationalist Church of Mars, and that's what we're waiting on. You're going to have to do. We've reached the edge of the country. It's still large,
Right.
but at some point you got to turn back.
Right.
From there's nowhere else to go. And same with our Catholic friends will criticize Protestants for our infinite sort of visiparity. Which Catholics are always less united than they let on.
That's right. Yeah.
But for sure, it's very Protestantized in that way. But it's at some point, you can't do that infinitely either. Just breaking off and having second Congregationalist church.
That's right.
Of the town. Suppose there's infinite numbers, but at some point it gets absurd. So I think people need to accept the reality of what's happened in the post-war era, and then also just the reality of the history of our country. It's like at what point are you going to plant a flag and also take some ground back?
Right.
And this past strategy may have worked to, you could say, preserve orthodoxy and the gospel through whatever vehicle possible, but we're kind of coming to the end of infinite vehicles available.
So that's why I think
that's right.
And that's why I felt called to the church I'm in now. I left the Episcopal Church in 2024, and you could say, well, gee, you're not doing, you're not following your own rule here. And, the mechanics of why I left the Episcopal Church basically amounted to the Episcopal Church is a closed shop. It's almost, operates like a trust in many ways. And I was being shut out of pulpits. I had churches that were asking me to apply, and I would apply, and somehow my application never showed up in their inboxes and that sort of thing. So, and that happened, unfortunately, right here, in the Northeast where I live. So I looked at there were Congregational churches in Connecticut. They have a much different polity in the sense that the congregation makes the call. Ironically, in the Episcopal Church, the polity of the Episcopal Church, strictly speaking, allows the vestries, which are like sessions or boards, to elect their pastor, their rector, but bishops increasingly are preventing that from happening, and they're willfully, not following their own rules, it seems. And so I might, because I was outspoken and started to advocate for things like the Reconquista in 2023, and even before that, I was speaking out against the whole, the nonsense regarding DEI and critical race theory. So I was starting to get a name for myself, where I was coloring outside of the lines. It goes back to what we were saying earlier, where I was naive about how big the tent really was, and also to accuse myself of what I think was a mistake on my part back in those days, is I was pulling my punches in the application parts of my sermons. I wasn't, I would preach. I never preached heresy, but then I would stop short of saying, and by the way, you really can't vote for candidates who are pro-abortion, right? I mean, that's just not a Christian thing to do. And so, I would stop short of saying that. I bought into this idea that, it would be good, or the model pastor is one whose politics can never be guessed, that the Democrat or the socialist thinks he's just as much their pastor as the conservative or the Republican or whatever thinks he's theirs. And there's a sense in which that makes sense, but that only works in a Christendom kind of situation. That only works when the laws are clearly established and they are Christian laws, and we're all working together under a common framework. When you have subversives and Marxists and progressives, who, it's all the same word, same people, who are deliberately trying to destroy what it is you have, you cannot pastor them. They are the wolves that you need to drive out. And so I never cultivated that second voice that Calvin says a preacher needs to have, which is, the voice that drives away the wolves. And once I started to do that, even just very softly, I found that the doors were closed to me in the Episcopal Church, and that the Episcopal hierarchy was willing to break its own rules rules and step in and interfere with the normal election process that would allow someone like me, a conservative, to actually be called to some of these churches. So I cast my net a little bit wider and found some of these congregational churches that are still conservative, and they've never lost the power or the authority. They've never forgotten that they have the power and the authority to call their pastor. So about this time last year, I found the church that I'm currently pastoring. We had about eight members. They called me. It's part of the United Church of Christ, which it still, I think, is farther to the left than the Episcopal Church, although the Episcopal Church is almost caught up to it. So, they went outside of the normal process and called a non-UCC minister to fill the pulpit, but that is something they're allowed to do. And the church we've doubled our membership. We've got the attendance is growing. So this is actually an example of how it can work, Reconquista, of going back into these dying churches and revitalizing them. And, ironically, this is exactly the blueprint I wrote about 2.5 years ago for that first article I wrote when I sat down to disabuse Redeemed Zoomer of his ideas. So here I am living it.
Well, and I think it should be instructive too for even those who are not in any mainline churches and have no intention of going to them, but there's similar dynamics you're describing that occur in evangelical churches, even good ones and denominations, of how this sort of functions, and pastors very confused about or uncertain about applying the second voice you're talking about in their preaching, as it being almost a breaking of some kind of ethic to assume and to preach at wolves that are in your congregation. It has to be the Big Ten. It has to be apolitical. It has to be neutral, and so they're not allowed to sort of identify these threats. And I think that's instructive in saying that if you don't do this, you'll go the way of the main line as well. Right. And then we'll just have to revitalize everyone. We don't want to do that. So, well,
that's it. That's another reason for them to care, is that their own denominations, whether it's PCA or Southern Baptist, as alluded to William Wolfe earlier, he's, trying to do that with the Center for Baptist Leadership. The fight is going to come to you, whether you want it to or not.
So talk to us a little bit about what you're doing in connection with Reconquista and this sort of move. And it does seem to be growing in at least people's interest. Certainly online, there's more and more talk about it, and I have to assume that's materializing in some way. But talk to me a little bit about what you're doing with litigation and properties and buildings and these things.
So I had an editorial come out in the Hartford Courant over the summer in July, where it was in response to Dean Sterling's. Dean Sterling is the dean of the Yale Divinity School, and he wrote an editorial basically saying to the Trump administration, don't take away our endowments, because our endowments are used to train ministers, and ministers go out and do good things. And I wrote back and said, well, yeah, the ministers should go out and do good things. And no, the government, you don't need. Sorry, the editorial was saying, don't take away our government grants, right? And because that was what Trump was threatening to do. And so I wrote back and said, you don't need the government grants. You actually have an endowment that was donated for this purpose, to train ministers and send them out to do good things. But you're not doing that. You're raising up ministers who are preaching, a foreign gospel to what the original intent of the donors would have been. And I cited, there's an example from my own church where you'll appreciate this because it has to do with the halfway covenant. This was founded as a halfway covenant church in 1670, and eventually the halfway covenant persisted here for about 70 years. They called a new minister. Ministers served for like 60 years at that time. So the halfway covenant minister went to his reward. They called a new minister who abolished the halfway covenant and made it, I guess, if you're baptized, you're a member. Everyone's a member. There's no rank in membership. If you're a member of the church, you're a member of the church. And then he stipulated. He said, "I'm donating the parsonage to the church for its use in perpetuity, provided that the halfway covenant never ever comes back. Because if the halfway covenant comes back, then this parsonage will go to my heirs, my descendants." So, that put me onto the idea that there must be, if I could find one, in my church, but not even looking very hard, there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of examples in, gift instruments, wills, bequests with clawback clauses to, Princeton or Harvard or Yale or any of these little churches that say, if the theology of this church substantially differs, then the proceeds of the estate or the gift must be returned. Mm-hmm. And, you can see this. A striking example is, I'm frankly appalled and saddened to see the number of churches in Connecticut that are being turned into mosques. And I think no way did the original donors, all, however many of them there were, hundreds, thousands, ever intend for this place to be a non-Christian house of worship, right? And so at the very least, and I understand that churches die, and I understand that neighborhood demographics change, right? And I'm not saying you need to preserve these places as museums, but at the very least, that when they are sold and money changes hands, that doesn't just go into the coffers of a progressive bureaucracy, which is what the associations and the presbyteries and the dioceses of many of these mainline churches are. And what I'm increasingly concerned about is that the presbyteries, the associations, the classices, the dioceses or whatever are becoming real estate investment trusts. In other words, they've got a lot of dying churches in a lot of prime locations, and they're worth a lot more on paper than they are, sitting there unused. So they will think of or look for ways to try to sell them and liquidate them. That's, part of this is the whole low income housing scheme that many of these churches are part of the lobbying groups that are trying to get rid of home rule, basically saying that, the state legislature can control all zoning and override any local ordinances about what can be done. Well, if you're a church, if you're a denomination and you have, you're a local presbytery or a local bishop and, you've got 6 or 7 closed churches, and you can't do anything with them because of the zoning restrictions, you're all in favor of this, because then you can either have them torn and sold and torn down for quote unquote low income housing, and you'll get a very nice payday. So my concern is that while I don't think that we could stop that entirely, some of that money needs to be redirected. Some of that money needs to be clawed back and put to the original intent, put to the use of the donor's original intent, which would mean to raise up and train godly men for biblical ministry in those towns, because that's what the money was for.
Yeah, this is anecdotal, but it's I had a friend, we'll just say in the Northeast, that had been part of an Episcopalian church, and he had trained for ministry at a good seminary, but their church wanted to break off from the diocese, and because they're a conservative church, and I forget what they were going to go after that, and they wanted their building, right? And the diocese said, and they offered a fair market price for the building. The diocese decided to sell it to Muslims cheaper. Sort of
that's as you say, that is straight up demoralization, right? That is, that is spiteful, really. So
it is, and so it's more, it's totally true. And the main thing happening is them maintaining, as you're saying, a sort of slush fund. But the other is still part of this demoralization. It's amazing how spiteful it was, actually. So,
and that's another reason people should care. I mean, that's another reason people should care. There's the idea of the public trust. If churches are representing themselves as charitable organizations with, not even charitable, but as religious organizations whose primary purpose is to worship, provide for the service and worship of Almighty God. If that's not what they're doing, then it is in the interest of the public trust to expose that and then to demand that they be reorganized in some way. Because you can't just say, I'm still a church if you're running a Burger King franchise, right? And I'm making an absurd argument there to make the point, which is that, at some point, some attorney general, particularly, preferably in a red state, somewhere Texas or whatever, could start looking into this. And the thing is that most of these denominations are organized as national bodies. Like, for instance, the Episcopal Church operates in every state in multiple dioceses, but there's a single New York State corporation that everything rolls up to, right? So, the Attorney General of Texas ought to be able to get standing, or some other state ought to be able to get standing against these corporations and say, look, I want to do discovery. I want to know what's really happening.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the courts notoriously struggle to handle religious things because they are averse to ever getting into sort of doctrinal distinctions. But
this isn't even doctrinal. This is are you
exactly.
are you what you say you are?
Right. It wouldn't require them to make distinctions that are impossible for them to make, or that they really hate making in many cases with the uses of these properties. So
Right.
I think it's it's a fascinating and innovative and needed approach to this to recognize what's really going on. But again, requires some level of real knowledge about how these bodies function and how they're constructed, because I think most people are just completely ignorant of their existence.
Well, I think we were all surprised to see when Doge was still going, just how much money was being directed to, Lutheran community services, Lutheran services, or Catholic charities for resettlement of migrants. Right. I mean, yes. I was aware of that, during my time in the Episcopal Church. I saw that. I thought, wow, we at least we are a large government contractor, aren't we? And the thing is, it's like, these denominations, Presbyterian, Episcopal, Congregationalists, whatever, we've been government contractors since the 19th century. The government contracted with Protestant denominations to resettle Indians and put them in boarding schools on reservations to quote unquote Christianize them and Americanize them. That was government federal policy at the time towards the Indian nations, and they contracted Protestant denominations to do that. So, let's just follow the money. And especially when Antifa has been declared a domestic terror threat right now. Well, Doge, I think, it started to expose some interesting threats, interesting connections. And I would be curious to see where that money trail goes.
Yeah. So what are next steps then in this regard? You sort of started identifying a problem and a potential way to trace out the problem. Where do you take this from here?
Well, I think we need probably, if we want to explore the donor intent angle, we need some living donors. It's probably easiest to deal with a living party that's been, aggrieved, and, whether it's a widow or even, a direct, an heir, an immediate heir, because that's going to be a lot easier, I think, than trying to litigate something that happened in the 19th century. But, we need to look for something that's a good test case, but that may then open up a bill, an opportunity to establish a precedent that would allow us to go after some of other some of the more historic abuses that I'm talking about. That's one angle. I think the other angle is to get this idea in front of sympathetic attorney generals at the various states levels who are willing to go after this. I'm under no illusion that the attorney general in Connecticut is going to exercise his constitutional duty and start going after churches that are promoting licentious behavior. But I can't believe Connecticut is the only state that has such a constitutional provision. So, someone who's willing to be creative, and particularly an attorney general who is willing to be creative and understands the threat, that understands that, this isn't just, as we've been saying all along, this isn't just about nice buildings, and it's not just about demoralization, as important as those two things are, but that these organizations calling themselves churches, flying under the color of religion, are engaged in active harm.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I do think they are engaged in active harm, and I think no better time than coming up on the 250th anniversary of our country to pay attention to these. I mean, a lot of these are historic landmarks in the literal sense, and being used, whether it's for propaganda, on the outside of their building, or to funnel money to subversive purposes. Both of these things should strike us as particularly offensive if we're going to celebrate, next year in any meaningful way, beyond just parades. Should strike us as offensive, should be to our history and to the moral conscience of the nation. So I think this is a great thing to start, now that you're sort of getting out there and talking about it, to be publicizing. And I do hope some people will take you up on it. So sort of in both of these projects, one, so what we were just talking about is sort of requires some political will and awareness and power even to pursue these things. The former requires, a certain kind of evangelistic spirit out of Orthodox Protestants. Pulling those two things together, I mean, are you optimistic in what you're seeing, that what you've seen so far and what you've experienced yourself, that this is gaining steam, that this is going somewhere, and people are at least beginning to develop awareness about it?
I'm optimistic for the first time in my adult life, which is, saying a lot because I was not a glass half full guy. I was a glass is empty kind of guy. So it was, the reason I'm optimistic is that I'm seeing, Generation Z guys like Redeem Zoomer yesterday I was on the phone for an hour with a college student who subscribed to my Substack, paid the $300 founding member fee. And I thought, well, that certainly entitles him to a phone call. And he wanted to talk to me about, should he stay in one of these mainline churches, or what is the criteria for leaving, and how do you live a faithful life? So I'm seeing a lot of that. The number of new people who have reached out to me or come to church in the last 3 weeks since the Charlie Kirk's murder, whether that is sustainable, I don't know. Whether it lasts, I don't know. But it stirred people, and I think people have had enough, and what I have seen is that people are looking for the kind of preaching that I'm willing to do now, and I've been doing this since I got here, so for about a year, which is just connecting the dots, spelling it out in plain and simple terms that no, we can't do this. Obergefell was wrong. It has to be overturned. Marriage is between one man and one woman. The state law needs to reflect that. And, to say that from the pulpit, people are like, thank God, right? And so I think if I can do it, it ought to give courage to other pastors to do it, because I think you're gonna it's like a geyser is gonna erupt. You're gonna get people, to respond and come to your church, and I do think we are in the midst of a revival. It may not be numerically like this first or second Great Awakening, but I think it could result in the revival of these institutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I hope it's not like the second Great Awakening. That's really stuff, But the first one wasn't so bad. But and I do think this is not meant to be flippant at all. But especially with Gen Z, I see the Reconquista. At least you could say energy. I suppose they're not all doing something about it, but the energy does seem to have the effect of combating or providing an alternative to the trend that we've seen with my generation and down in Protestant world, which is swimming the Tiber for something. I think for many reasons, but part of it is aesthetic. Part of it's the need for, which I don't discount. Part of it's the need, a desire for something that feels historical and rooted. These sorts of impulses, which are all good and legitimate. And so this does provide, as I've kind of noticed online, something of an alternative to that trend and energy. Which I think is a good thing, to have a goal like this, to have somewhere to invest in, and a challenge even, especially to young men, is attractive. So I think that's a good externality of all this, if nothing else.
I agree. I mean, my church is a perfect example. We are the ancient church of Connecticut. We are, my church, the building itself, the meeting house dates from 1818, the congregation from 1670. We are older than any Catholic church, older than any Orthodox church, older than any other church, other than our own kind in Connecticut. So if you're looking for the American Orthodoxy, the American Catholicism, look no further than your lowercase c Catholic Church here, which is, the Congregational Church. We are the first church. So this is these are the ones you should be supporting.
Yeah. Well, it adds that too, which again, to our Romanist friends, they will probably resent it, but it adds the benefit. There is also the element of patriotism to your native country, which they simply can't provide. I think, if I'm recalling right, 1818 is when Connecticut actually got its first constitution. Before that, it had been operating with the charter still.
Fundamental orders, right? So yeah, in 1818 is, depending on how you. I'm going to say, unfortunately, is when the church was officially disestablished, thanks to the preaching of an Episcopal minister in New Haven. But the vote was fairly close. It was something like 11,000 against disestablishment, and about 12,000 were in favor of it. So it's I'm not sure. I don't know. On the one hand, I would, if we still had something like an established church in this state, I'm sure it would have been one of the many institutions that was subverted. On the other hand, to formally remove, the recognition of the civil magistrate's duty to uphold and maintain the church was unfortunate.
Well, and it hurts, hurt New England when they, the potential junto was discovered. A lot of the Federalists were potentially going to secede with
Right.
New England, and that hurt most of them. They
Right.
wanted the disestablishment was in part motivated by reducing power,
Right.
in New England. So many things, but I agree with that assessment. I mean, it's how Providence works. And in Providence now you have the opportunity to do something, something different, and maybe claw back some territory. So totally commend you on that. And I would recommend everyone to follow your work. What is it, direct us to your Substack and to
Sure.
other things you're writing or speaking on so people can go check them out, and then we'll provide notes as well.
Sure. You can check out my byline at American Reformer. My Substack is experimental sermons and jwdell.substack. And then my Twitter X is at Jake Dell 73.
Excellent. Well, Jake, thank you so much for giving us your time today and coming on to talk about these things. I think I think it's important work and fascinating work. So do encourage everyone to pay attention to it and to contact you if they have things they want to learn about or contribute. They should contact you. So audience, go do that. And thank you as always for tuning in. And until next time, God bless.
You can find American Reformer on the internet at www.americanreformer.org or on x.com, formerly Twitter, at @AMReformer. Don't forget to like, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Please consider supporting us today by making a tax-deductible donation through our secure online donation portal at americanreformer.org. That's americanreformer.org.